welcome you to what will actually be our last webinar of the summer. We're going to pause it and take a summer break, and then we will be back in September. More on that towards the end of the call. We'll have information at the end of the call on when we'll be having that last session, or when we'll start back on September 11th. I'm super excited about the topic today because I think it's really important. I don't think we realize how important reflection is to our thinking process and for our growth and development. So today's session is on reflective practice. I've invited Ursula and Brian to join us this morning. Ursula has a passion for this topic, as do I, and we'll be talking about some basics about developing reflective practice. Brian did a master's thesis at his company, and he'll be sharing some of the information that he gleaned from the study. And so what's our why? We still want these to be coaching conversations. We invite panels of people to join us to think about the topic and sharpening your saw in terms of reflection for coaching and your own practice. And hopefully my goal is that you take just one idea away this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. But if you take one idea away, we were successful, so that you can use these tools for and resources for your own growth and development. So just a few housekeeping important facts. Use the Q&A to post your questions. Just a gentle reminder, everyone can see your questions. We will do Q&A after every sub piece of our conversations. And if your question isn't answered, make sure you stay with us at Global IOC, because we'll post them in the community area. And also make sure you follow us on LinkedIn, because we'll be posting things. Although we're not going to be doing webinars, we're going to be posting blogs. So there's going to be things you can read. We're going to be putting more in thought leadership this summer. So we'll be populating those areas. So make sure you join us on LinkedIn and also at our Global IOC site. So without further ado, well, I'm going to start off by talking about the study. This is actually a study by Braun Hagerty, where he talked about what are the dimensions of reflective practice. So I want to start us thinking about, get our juices going with reflective practice. The importance of reflective practice is that we do it regularly, that we think about it informing our own action research. What does it mean as we're the researchers about our own work? What critically analyzing what we do and how we do it and what it looks like and what are successes, and then what are other people saying? So what's in the literature? What do we learn from each other? And then once we have that process, how can we innovate in our own coaching and leading to more effective practice with our clients? And then a more inclusive practice. So what would that look like, to think about how that could be more inclusive in terms of how we work as a coach? And then finally, how are we learning and growing and developing? And so from reflecting regularly to professional learning. So when we do all these pieces, as you follow that little diagram, then we start thinking about, what does reflective practice mean to us? So I am going to turn it over to Ursula. And Ursula, let me know when you want me to turn the slide. So I'll start you right there.
Thank you, Peggy. Hello, everyone. And since I always wanted to be a TV announcer when I was small, I'm going to say now I'm broadcasting from Switzerland. So this feels really good. So welcome, everybody, wherever you are in the world. Hope you are all doing great and you're safe and healthy. Speaking today about reflection, Peggy already announced, yes, we have a great passion for reflection, and it is probably one of the most underestimated resources and tools that we as practitioners, as coaches have. And as Bennett and Rogers put it so nicely, we can hone our intuitive skills, and we'll come back to that in a little bit, which again is tied to self-awareness. So we are tying it now to the emotional and social competencies. And again, with the liberation that comes with a sense of being a coach. Here I want to add one thought for you, being a coach. So in addition to knowing, in addition to the competencies, in addition to doing more the skills, we are now speaking about being, and being in a process of co-creating, reflecting with another person. And we'll explore together with Brian and Peggy what that specifically means. But for you just to hang your hat on, being in addition to doing, in addition to knowing. Those are very distinct and very important compartments for us as coaches. Next slide, Peggy. Thank you. One up. Thank you. As Peggy was just taking you through the 9 dimensions, you can see it's a process. It is an activity that can be learned, and it's a muscle. So here it's like a muscle. So obviously it's a skill that you can develop, and as you develop it and gradually increase your capacity to engage in observation and asking critical questions. What is important here when we say to engage in observation, it is not to observe other people only. It is also to observe oneself, to observe ourselves and start to really tune in and probe ourselves as well as others. Asking critical questions, this doesn't mean we are starting to be naggy or challenging. Asking critical question means deeper. You probe the foundational assumptions, the beliefs you are operating on, and likewise your coachee, your client is working on. So as you ask critical questions, it means you go deeper. It is not the naggy type, just for that to be clear. Next slide, Peggy. Thank you. So there are different ways how you can develop that muscle of reflection, how you develop reflective capacity. And we are looking at it by a temporal feature, by time, as you gain distance to the actual experience. What has been defined, there are 2 types of reflection. It's either the reflection in action, while you're rolling, while you're with a client, while you are in an experience. It takes place while you are actually involved in a situation. And during that situation, you observe yourself, but you also observe your client. What am I thinking? What are they thinking, feeling, and so forth? Then there is it's not a nice word, but for a lack of a better term, the post-mortem is more the reflection on action. It's afterwards. You look back on an experience, you step back and you take the helicopter view and you explore, you reflect on the experience after it has occurred. That's the difference. In action, while you're rolling, while you're at it, it's a bit of a bizarre concept for many at the beginning, while you're in it, to observe yourself, to observe the other. But as I said, it's a muscle and you can start developing it. Or afterwards you take account. Peggy? So I'm starting with the second one a bit more. Reflection on action. That's what I also call the post-mortem. You look back. What worked well? What did I accomplish? What didn't work as well? And also you look back at, did I have a good grasp on what I want to accomplish? What was meant to be effective? How was effective defined? And again, was the situation clear for the client, for their situation? How did they go out of the experience of being coached? What would I do differently next time? So clearly, reflection on action, that's the most important. You look back and you ask yourself these questions on, did I accomplish what I wanted to accomplish? What did I want to accomplish to begin with? How did I go there? Could I have gone a different way? What would have been the difference if I had? These kinds of questions. Next slide, Peggy. Thank you. So still being in the post-mortem, in the reflection on action, as you want to build your muscle, as you keep looking back at the evening of a work day or when you have some time, stepping back even further, looking across clients, do I see a pattern? Do I consistently make the same mistake? Do I consistently make something really well? What is it? What are my processes? What is my framework? Does it work? Have I applied the right framework, the right tools? How did I feel? How did this interaction make me feel? You reflect back and you, what was there for me? Again, looking back. You're also, and here I'm talking about critical questions. Now you really look at your beliefs, your assumptions that might influence and impact your ability to work with a client. Has anything come into my way? Do I have any blind spots? Are biases playing in here? Are my emotions playing in? But you also ask these critical questions about the client. You reflect on that. What are we building our relationship on? What are we building our work on? Are there certain hypotheses? Are we clear about these? How can I challenge them? You look back. Next slide, Peggy. So now you will see I'm looking, and I mentioned that before, as first, the reflection in action. And here's something very important on this slide that you might already have picked up. It uses the past tense, and it actually would be better if it was speaking in present tense. But we are referring to the work of Kovac and Corey, and so we left it in the original text as it was presented. But if you are truly in the situation, you truly reflect in action, you are sitting there with your client and you're asking myself, what am I missing here? Or is there something I'm not considering? What is going on? What is not going through my mind? What is going on with the client? What is going through his or her mind? What is my line of inquiry here? Where am I going? Where's the soul thing going? What is she thinking? Where are we? What is our world? What are we basing this on? So again, I wanted to highlight this to you. Reflection in action. As you roll, you have these considerations, and I encourage you to pose these questions in present tense. You are in the here and in the now. That is the intent. And the closer you're able of moving your reflection into the here and now, sometimes you might be picking up 5 minutes later in the session. You're like, oops, did I really just say that 5 minutes ago? The more you can move that into the right now, right here, the more it is the in the true spirit of the reflection and action. But it takes experience to get there. And as we are looking with Peggy and Brian a little later on how to approach reflection, especially if there's a lot of stuff going on at the same time, it takes experience. And you might only just pick up on one communication channel. What am I feeling? And then a little bit later, a few weeks later, you might be picking up what is the client feeling, what I'm feeling. It takes experience to get there. Yes, Peggy, next slide. So again, here are just some additional examples. If you just need to have some brain food on what to ask yourself, how to challenge yourself, what different angles you can use to examine your practice. And again, there is no good question, there's no bad question. It's just important that you ask yourself questions, that you ask others these reflective questions that propel them into a state of critically, again, not naggy, but deeper, more profoundly examining their assumptions, their beliefs, what they did, their practice. And like Peggy said, looking at our practice, was it good? Where do we need development? And also, how can we restore ourselves? Reflection, a reflective place, is also a place where we can restore ourselves, where we can recharge. and find new ideas. We can find solutions, and we can also find a little bit of that mindfulness. Yes, Peggy? There are different approaches to reflective practice. Some can do it while they are driving a car. Others, they can do it while they are walking. Again, reflecting on action. You can do that anytime, whenever you have some moments where you can engage in some reflection. Reflection in action, obviously, ideally, is while you are in a session. Some respond very positively to scheduled time. Some do it while they meditate, others while they do their shopping, others while they are in the car. It depends how you prefer to just engage and can push yourself into a deeper state. Again, there are no rules other than just contemplate, ask yourself, reflect, change the lenses on how you're looking at your practice. Think about it from the perspective of your client. You can have a diary, you can listen to recordings from your sessions, you can have a journal. Very effective also is peer reflection. Doesn't even need to be peer supervision, just reflection. Rolling it with another person adds a lot. You can work off notes, or you can, in any form, how you capture your impressions, what you're working off, how your framework, how you approach your clients, anything works. Those are just some ideas, nothing cut in stone. Yes, I think that is Peggy. Next slide. Here we go.
Yeah, so now we're going to take some questions from the audience. So please put them in chat if you have any questions for either Ursula, Brian, or myself. So I'll start with a question I have for Ursula. So Ursula, can you talk more about what happens when a client and a coach reflect together, when they're in a reflective state? What is going on then?
That is a very good question, Peggy. And it is also that we often ask ourselves as coaches, how do I move a client into a reflective state? A very important aspect here is the relationship between the coach and the coachee. It is very difficult to have a client whom you see for the first time and you're just like, okay, time out, now we think, now we reflect. A relationship between the client and the coach is critical. The trust is critical. To create a space of safety, of psychologically safety, where you really can spin and reflect and think and also share some thoughts that might just pop off the top of your head. So all these things are very important in creating that reflective state. And one more thing to say, obviously we always want to create well, how you always also call it, the PEA with the client, Peggy, but it's not enough. It is not enough to spin somebody into a reflective state. You also need to try to activate, and this is here Boyatz speaking, the empathic network and bringing him or her into more of an emotional state, so that especially when you are in executive coaching and you have these very analytical, task-oriented minds, to move them a bit into the emotional, social range by asking questions that activate that. Questions about the dream, about the vision, where do you want to get to, what is important to you, and not just like the boom, 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 what's your goal, what's your objective. So all of that together would bring somebody into a reflective state. Did that answer your question?
It did. So, and I love that you added that extra piece of the emotional part. And so we do have a question, but I'm going to answer it in my part because they're asking about models for reflection, and we're going to talk about Clutterbuck's model for reflection. And we might even be able to throw some thinking hats in there. So I'm going to move it to Brian Kelly, who is a certified master business coach and was part of the nationwide program where the master program ended with a master's degree from Middlesex University in the UK. The Global IOC master's program ends with a master's degree at the University of Wales. So we have the same kind of process for those of you who are on the call if you're interested in engaging in the master work. So Brian, let's get you started. Brian, talk us a little bit about your study and what you found out about reflection.
Well, thanks, Peggy, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you've called into. Ursula, I just think your presentation was very, very insightful. You mentioned a couple of things that I hope we can all keep in mind as I go through my brief presentation here. One had to do with observing one's self, and there's a lot to be said in terms of the coaching that we do at the organization of which I'm a member, in terms of encouraging associates to reflect not just during a session with their coach, but to reflect all the time. We work with a lot of salespeople who typically would move from one sales call to the next, to the next, to the next. And even though, as Ursula said, maybe they had some time in the car going from point A to point B, how do they take that time for at least a few moments to reflect on that past experience, that appointment or that meeting that they just had? And simply from the standpoint of, what went well, what would I change if I had the opportunity to do it again? And how will I remember the next time to do it a little bit differently? And then reflect back on the results of that change. So it's very interesting that Ursula mentioned that, because that's exactly what we're in the process of doing with our organization. And she also mentioned late in the presentation about working with task-focused individuals. And gosh, we have plenty of those in the organization of which I'm a member. So how do we get this task-focused individual to reflect? And even more important than that, why would they even want to reflect? So this is the whole idea of starting with why, and not just dictating that, you need to do more reflection, coming back with an idea to say more reflection can help you in such and such a way. So I just want to echo that what Ursula said. I think hopefully it ties into what I'm talking about here. Three kinds of reflection. A lot of the work that I did involved a lot of the work that Jack Mesereau did. And three kinds of reflection mentioned in his research being content reflection, process reflection, and premise reflection. And just the idea that premise reflection leads to questioning the relevance of the problem itself, the assumptions, the beliefs, the values. I think we could throw biases in there. It's distinct from problem solving, and this can lead to transformative learning. And that's what we do at our organization is the focus is on transformational learning or transformational change, as opposed to transactional change or transactional coaching. The old sports coach, not that there's anything wrong with sports coaching, but it can be very, very transactional. Here we're talking about transformative learning or transformative behavior change. So we get into a little bit more information in terms of instrumental learning, communicative learning, and reflective learning. And instrumental learning, as we find out, is very, very, Ursula mentioned, this idea of focusing on the task. And we do work with individuals who are doing some transformational behavior on their own in terms of this check the box mentality. And I'm sure everyone has worked with this type of individual, and to a certain extent, I can be that way myself, to this idea of moving away from the task-focused problem solving, focusing on content or procedural assumptions. And that's as far as the reflection goes. So how do we move into communicative learning, understanding the meaning of what others communicate as having to do with values? Again, why would I change what I've done and that's made me successful for the past 15 or 20 years? And we experience a lot of this in the type of coaching that we do, this idea of, as Goldsmith would say, what got you here won't get you there. So what was effective and efficient behaviors 10 to 15 years ago have not suddenly, but have over the past few years sort of fallen out of favor. And even more than that, they just don't seem to work anymore. So how do we move into this communicative style of learning, the focus on coherence, not control, the idea maybe of coaching with compassion versus coaching for compliance? Ursula mentioned boyatzis a few moments ago. This is a boyatzis concept that we've done a lot with at Nationwide, and it's interesting that the culture of our organization and many organizations has been a culture of coaching for compliance. So, and then how do we get into finally a reflective mode of learning, setting aside, or as it says, holding our biases in abeyance, making a determination about the justifiability of an idea whose meaning is contested. So what is it? What have I overlooked? What am I so connected to or wedded to that I just can't quite get past that? I can't quite set that aside. And how does coaching encourage, through the coaching conversations and the coaching relationship, to set those aside or move without them, move forward without them? Reflecting, as you can see, the reflection involved is reflecting and communicating in order to arrive at an agreement about the justification of an expressed idea, as opposed to, I'm the leader and this is what you do, so go do it, versus I'm the leader and you're the associate. Let's talk this whole thing through. Yes, we're involved in business coaching, and business coaching ultimately at the end of the day drives results. But how do we move into an area where results can be driven that benefits both parties? It's a win-win, and actually benefits that third party, which is the organization. So how do all those parties win? And reflective learning has a lot to do with getting there. So some of the findings from the study, it was really an interesting and a very, very beneficial process to go through. I think Peggy held the door open here for me to step through, and I guess I finally stepped through it. But this idea, I thought, okay, adults learn just the way I used to learn when I was in high school or college. And it's, few things could be further from the truth. And the idea that adults learn, and this is Malcolm Knowles and a lot of the work that Knowles has done in this, adults learn very differently. And for any of us who are baby boomers, let's say, we realize that at some point, probably in our early 20s, that it's just like, gosh, I can't sit in front of a book and memorize things as well as I used to. I guess I could if I had to, but why is it that I learn differently? And Knowles did a tremendous amount of research that we're experiential learners, because we're not coming in with a blank slate. And how does reflecting on something similar to what I'm trying to learn, how does that help us learn, as opposed to, okay, blank slate, I'm starting to learn something that is nothing like anything I've ever learned before. So it was a fascinating not amount of research, but quality of research that I got involved in doing. And it really helped me understand, and it's helped some of our clients understand, that adults just learn differently. So the findings from the study is the coaching conversation rarely gives the associate an opportunity to reflect. And that's, it was just kind of surprising, is, how often, the question asked, how often does your leader give you the opportunity to reflect, or how often do you take the opportunity to reflect? And that was met with lots of question marks. And the big question marks, well, why would I want to do that? So again, the reason you want to do that is it ties into how adults learn and how they change their behavior. Connection of adult coaching to adult learning is ineffectual at best, and maybe completely absent in most coaching conversations. Yeah, that was a bit of a shocker. And the idea that if it's not being encouraged in the coaching conversation, then the chances of the individual embarking on a reflective moment themselves is pretty remote. Survey indicates that more than 85% of adults learn more effectively when they understand the why. You know, and most organizations are the same as the organization for which I work, is that we're really good with the what and the how. But what about the why? And adults need that. Part of the adult learning process is we need to be clear on the why. More than 89% of the respondents claim that thinking back and connecting past experiences to new concepts frequently or almost always, it helps them learn. This reflecting back and connecting it to, oh, it's like something I learned 2 years ago or 13 years ago or whatever it is, helps them to learn these concepts more effective and more efficiently. Leaders are not opposed to allowing time for the associate to reflect, but they're unaware of the positive potential that it has. Again, going back to what Ursula said, you know, task-focused individuals don't always realize that they can be even more effective if they reflect and if their associates reflect. And that leaders often move into the fix-it mode, okay, with the best of intentions normally. Many times it's a factor of time. You know, geez, I've got a half an hour for you, and then I have to move on to the next person and the next person. I have X number of people who are direct reports. I've got a calendar full of meetings. We need to be in this fix-it mode, this task-focused mode, task-focused conversation mode during the coaching interaction. And let's check the box. We talked about doing it differently. Boom, I'm just going to assume that you're going to be able to do it differently. We don't reflect. They didn't reflect to determine their own solution.
So Brian, we were side by side doing this work together. What were some of your biggest surprises as you did your interviews?
It really had to do with reflection. And as I touched on a second ago, it wasn't even reflection why, it was reflection, more of a, what do you mean by that? So it was just this idea that even though the coaching questions that we as coaches would ask, the leaders still didn't get it in terms of why would I even want to go down that road? Why would I encourage someone to go down that road? Because in reality, it just helps people learn and it helps them change a behavior. But yeah, Peggy, the quick answer to your question is, yeah, reflection, just a big question mark. What the heck are you talking about?
So I have another question for you before we move on. So
Sure.
This question is about, in coaching leaders, we encourage them to show their vulnerability to be more effective. And it dovetails into a question I was going to ask you is, could you see any connection to fear in reflection? What is going to come up if I reflect? What am I going to have to acknowledge? And so do I avoid reflection because this is showing up? So can you speak to how we as coaches similarly present vulnerabilities during coaching interaction, and what is the value? So, you know, there's
Sure.
vulnerability when we reflect together and just when we reflect.
Well, sure, and that's a great question, Peggy, because it covers a lot of the topics in terms of there's a fear that's involved with any type of discussion or any type of admitting to some the fact that they might not know the answer. I'm your leader, and I should have all the answers, and I encourage you to come to me with all of your questions that you have because I have all the answers. Well, this idea of reflecting. And to have a leader say, you know, I have some ideas on how you could change your behavior differently, but I want to hear from you. And the fear of the leader has to do with, well, you know, maybe they're going to come up with something that I don't really know very much about, and I don't know whether that change of behavior is going to have a positive impact or if it's going to get us where we need to be. So I need to be prescriptive because I'm afraid that they're going to come up with some crazy idea and it's going to maybe make me look bad or maybe make this part of the organization look bad. So this idea of setting your fears aside and saying, you know, Mary, what do you think? How would you do it differently? The leader had to move away from the idea that, you know, I don't have all the answers. And because I don't have all the answers, I'm looking to the person closest to the situation to come up with some new ideas. So did that help?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, we have to be willing to be open to new ideas, but also vulnerable in case it's not something that aligns with where the direction we're
Yeah.
going as
Yeah,
leaders.
we have to be willing to get out of our comfort zone,
Yeah.
and that's that can be kind of scary at times. So yeah, that's where we were with that.
Well, thanks. So now I'm going to answer the first question we had, which is to talk about 7 conversations. So in the work that we do at Global IOC, we incorporate a lot of leading researchers in on the topics that we're discussing. And David Clutterbuck has an amazing 7 conversations process when you think about going through your own reflective process and your client's process. So the 7 reflective conversations are, what am I talking about before I begin the session? So I was thinking today, if I could have, you would only do 2 pieces, and it connects back to what Ursula was talking about. If you only did 2 pieces, you would reflect on the action that you had in a previous session. So before the session, you're reflecting on what happened before, and then what you would be thinking about at the end. So at least beginning and at the end, if you could get your reflection pieces there. So what's the dialogue that you're having with yourself before you have the session? What do we think the client's inner dialogue is? And how would we know that if we didn't ask? So this is becoming the reflective partnership. So what were you thinking about before you came in today? What's most important to you? Those kinds of questions as part of our coaching process. What's going on for me? Ursula talked a lot about what are my feelings? What are my biases? What's coming up here? The spoken dialogue. What's the conversation that's happening between the coach and the client? Then what's the client thinking about during the conversation? What reflection after the conversation? And does the client reflect after the conversation? And I think these are really great ways of looking at how we can have reflective conversations. And if nothing else, get into those 2 spaces of before and after. So the Clutterbuck talks about the coach's inner dialogue. So first of all, what's the big picture for the client? Am I working with the client in their big picture? How am I helping them identify the big picture? Both Ursula and Brian talked about the work of Boyantzis, who talks about in the intended change theory, talks about what's real, what's ideal, what's the dream, what does the client really, really want? And then subsequent to that, what are they avoiding? So what's not happening? So how am I having a dialogue as a coach to think about what are they not talking about? And I had a coach that was working with me when I was working on my PhD. And for any of you that know about any kind of writing, sometimes we don't write as much as we should. And on one call with her, we were about 45 minutes into the call, and she said, just so you know, this is your call. You can do whatever you want, but we haven't talked about your writing. So, if you want to get that in the last 15 minutes. And I was like, okay, busted. And so it was clear that I was avoiding that conversation because I had been rabbit holing and chasing something else that was more interesting in the moment. And so the attitude, my doctoral research was on what are the critical factors that lead to success. And the one major critical factor is the relationship. So what are my relationships and what do they look like and what are my responsibilities to that relationship? So that's what's going on for me as a coach in my inner dialogue. So the client, we have these questions and they're available to help you guide the client in their reflection. So what did you learn today? Was there any shift you had in your thinking? And I am passionate about Global IOC's work in that we are thinking partners. So if we are thinking partners, then something is shifting during the coaching. What do I need some more help with? What have I tried? What's working? do I really want to solve my problem? I remember one time asking my mom that question and it didn't go very well. That's why I say we don't coach our family, okay? But she was talking about something and she kept talking about it and talking about it subsequently, maybe 3 months, 6 months, maybe a year. And finally I said to her, Mom, I mean this from a very kind space. Do you really want to solve the problem? And sometimes clients come to coaching and it goes back to what we were saying earlier. There's a fear of there's an uncertainty if I solve the problem. I know what's going to keep happening if I don't solve the problem, but what will happen if I solve it? And how do I feel about the relationship with my coach? And then the coaches. So Ursula was talking about you're probably going to be able to be successful before and after, but in the middle, sometimes it's hard to, to focus and to do reflection while you're coaching, but these are some of the questions that you can be asking yourself. What is the quality of my listening? Am I staying present? What am I hearing? What's missing? What's not happening? Am I using my intuition? And I really coach a lot around intuition because I believe intuition is connections you're making in your brain. So what's your gut telling you? I have clients that when I'm training coaches that are saying, oh, well, we shouldn't be asking questions. There's like, you shouldn't be going deep. You have to go deep. There's personal, that it felt too personal for one of my clients. And I said, but it's what's coming up for you. Something's missing for you. And so you're in this, what's missing and what's my gut telling me? Am I making assumptions? Do I have any biases? How am I crafting the next question? How am I going forward? And we also used David Clutterbuck's work around the managed eclectic process. So we move from models to processes to worldviews to what emerges and how do we stay with what's emerging. And what's the client thinking? Is the client engaged in helping the shift and the thinking process? And then the spoken conversation, is there consonance between? Is there congruence between what the person is saying and their body language? And now, because we can use Zoom to coach, we're not just coaching over the phone, we can really answer this question. Are we staying with the conversation or are we going around in circles? But that going around in circles is just keep repeating, but are we looking at different ways? Are we exploring issues from multiple perspectives? One of the questions we use at Global IOC is, if somebody else was giving you guidance on this issue, what would they be saying? So now we're going multiple perspectives. Who else might you ask about this? Who's doing most of the talking? Remember the 80-20 rule? What's the pace? Are both people engaged in the conversation? And are we exploring in enough depth? Are we just moving on? Is something coming up? And this comes a little bit back to the vulnerability. Are we willing to stay vulnerable while we're having the conversation? And then, is the client having a dialogue? And most likely they are. Hopefully they're having a dialogue around these questions and not what they're going to buy at the grocery store when they're done with this conversation. But am I being honest? It was funny because I can reflect now on that conversation that happened almost 13 years ago. I wasn't being honest with my coach. I hadn't done the work I committed to, and I was trying to dodge it, okay? Am I saying what I want to say? Am I getting it out? Am I being vulnerable? Am I willing to be vulnerable? What filters am I applying when somebody asks me questions? Am I trying to hide? When Brian and I were just having that conversation, I thought of the Johari window. When we think about, what is known to self but not known to others, are there things that I'm not contributing to the conversation? Am I uncomfortable? There we go back to that comfort that Brian was talking about. What can I learn? What am I learning and how is that shifting? Am I transforming? Or are we just transacting? And am I really helping my coach understand what's going on for me? And then we have the coach's reflection. Did I help? A lot of these questions Ursula already talked about, so I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. But think about it. Are we staying non-directive? Are we dealing with what's emerging? Did I create a bias for action? Is there an action step that my client is taking? Did I use insightful questions? What questions did I not try? Why didn't I ask that question? And we worked a lot with my client that said, well, those are very personal, but that was important. And it was organizational coaching even, but didn't want to go deeper because you're going to uncover some things. You're going to have those aha moments, which is why I think we coach. Did I challenge? Did I receive sufficient challenge in return? Does my client challenge me back? I love it when clients challenge back because we're not on the right answer. So there's another answer that we can get to because that doesn't work. Okay, what might work? Did I allow time to think and reflect? Did I reflect with them? Well, what about this? How am I building thinking and reflecting in? What did I learn from that conversation? What patterns can I discern? And Ursula talked about the patterns. So a lot of times, I think of things the next day, not always right after the conversation, but somehow I ponder them. And the next day I go, I could have asked this. So what could have you asked? What would you do differently? Do I have any negative emotions that are arising? Positive emotions as well. Am I still looking forward to working with this client? Does this client really still bring positivity to the coaching conversation? And then does the client reflect? And so I really encourage you to work with your clients to go back and reflect. And this connects to Brian's work. And I can remember how often we would talk about the whole idea of reflection and not having time for reflection. And when I started my PhD program, I went to Antioch University and they said that it was a reflective practice degree. And I was like, yeah, but I got to get done. And so I think we all are in that, yeah, I understand we need to do it, but I got to get done. I got to get this next thing. I got to pick up the kids. So, how can you engage your client in answering some of these questions? Even if you took one, okay, and said, what did I learn and how am I going to put it into practice? What did I learn in talking with my coach today? And how am I going to use it? How am I going to try that? What do I need to really think about? What came up for me that I need to really do a little more thinking about that? What do I want to explore with other people? I mean, coaches aren't the end all be all. What do I want to talk about? My family, my best friend. What do I want to explore? Did I bring the things up that are really important? When we talk about the ideal real self, if that's the model you're using, did I bring up the things that are really important? What could have I done to get more value from the coaching? What could have I done to make it more enjoyable for my coach? That's a clutterbutt question. I don't know whether I would throw that in, but think about, am I enjoying? And enjoyment was a word that I used in my dissertation, that the enjoyment of the two people coming together is really important. And what changed expectations do I have for myself based on this? We're still with the client. And am I looking forward to the next meeting? So before we go into more time to think, Ursula, Brian, people from, the participants, do you have any questions? And Andre, did that answer your question enough to say there's this process of 7 questions that Clutterbuck has it arranged into 7 conversations before, the coach before, the client before, during, the client after, the coach after, and then, what's happening in the conversation. And that's how we see 7. Like I said, I think to just get started, it's really important to do the first and at the beginning and at the end. So cool. Brian, any reflection on what we were just talking about with these 7 conversations? And by the way, you're on mute. You're gonna have to unmute. Cool.
Okay, how's that?
Perfect.
Okay. The only comment, Peggy, is that I'll underscore this idea of the coach asking a reflecting or a question that encourages reflection. And often what I've observed is that early on, the coach will ask a question that they think invites reflection, but it's actually kind of a leading question when you listen to it, where they're, tell me what you think the solution to this particular situation is. And the person will say it's A and it's B. And the coach will say, well, how about C? I mean, and C is the coach's idea. and they'll ask reflective questions. It's very thinly disguised, but it's actually a leading question. So it's just part of the learning process on the part of the coach. But that's what I've observed happens early on. So I like the 7 questions. Very good.
Ursula, what would you add?
I wanted to share just 2 very brief snippets that I really love in terms of when you're speaking about the inner dialogue, whether it's coach or the client, but it was Case who had already in the 80s explored this inner dialogue that is happening. And some call it the internal supervisor, the internal coach, whatever, but this inner voice. And he called it the islands of contemplation. And I just love that. And islands can grow, they can also disappear, and there can be clusters. So I just wanted to share that. And then what I also like is what Robin Shaw had once said, that reflection is the ability to think about the past in the present for the future. Reflection is the ability to think about the past in the present for the future. So it captures for me exactly what we were covering between you, Brian, and I today.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So we'll go on so we can finish. We're getting to the top of the hour. So one of the authors that I was introduced to when I moved to the UK 2 years ago was the work on thinking from Nancy Klein. And I love her work. And as we talk about, our position at Global IOC is that the coach is a thinking partner. Then what does it look like for us to really be thinking partners with our clients, okay? And what Nancy talks about, there are 10 thinking components. And if anybody wants this article, let me know, because we can get that out to you as well. But she says, first of all, in order to think with our clients, we have to give them attention, okay? And so, other authors would call this presence. But what does it mean to be present with our clients? And that is that we really care about what they're going to say, that we are present. We're not thinking about the grocery list or the laundry list or what we're going to do on the weekend. We're really staying present with the person, and we really care what they're going to say next, and we're there with them. And that, something that we haven't talked a lot about in our webinars is the idea of equality. And there is a difference, whether we want to admit it or not. There's a difference when the coach and the client come together, because there's an expectation of positional power. There's an expectation that the coach is going to know something and going to help me. So how do I create that equality between the client and I? And that, when I first started coaching and learning about coaching, that I always believed that the client has the answer. And that's how I create that equality, is I know it's in you. How can we help you get there? I'm a helper. I'm not a person that knows everything and knows what you need to do. I'm here to help you find the way for yourself. She has the concept of ease. Okay, so ease, and the way she describes it is, think about that word urgency. We're not in a rush. We're in a discovery process. Now, some people who are solution-focused coaches might think they are in a rush, but she talks about, there's an ease inside yourself to not get to the destination. The idea is to enjoy the journey and to be on the journey with your client. And then appreciate. And it's really funny because it's the appreciation of 5 times more than you criticize them. And so, Barbara Fredrickson and Losada have the Losada line where they say 3 positives to 1 negative, 6 if you want to have an ideal team. But just thinking about, from a PEA perspective, how important it is to be in that PEA space, or positive emotional attractor state, before we move into what's the action. Because as soon as we move into action, then we're changing the part of the brain that we're using. And the part of the brain that we're using is not the one that's the dreamer. It's the get it done. And then there's a pressure. Feelings, and we're talking about allowing people to really express their feelings. And there's a lot of work coming out now about emotional literacy, which is one of the topics that we want to use in the fall, because I think it's important for us to think about the emotional states and where people are, but to express them. You know, so often when people start expressing their feelings, particularly if they're ones that make us uncomfortable, you know, they're sad, maybe they cry in a session, or they're just really, really down, and we want to bring them up, but allow them to be in their feelings. That the information is accurate and shows respect for what's happening with the client, especially if they're in denial. And you know, when I'm in the development courses, there's a lot of questions that come up where the teams are asking, you know, how do we help people move through denial? And so what she is saying is the process through denial is to accept them where they are and then move them, and almost asking them if they're ready to move. Okay. Encouragement. I always say that, you know, the coach holds the vision for the client to walk into, because many times there's fear, there's vulnerability, and people aren't sure they can get there. So there's an encouragement. Diversity. Brian brought this up. You know, what's door number one? What's door number two? Oh, let me throw my idea in and see if I can move you towards my idea. But more for her, she's thinking about, you know, diversity is the difference in thinking. You know, and there are many times as a coach, I find myself saying to a client, wow, I never thought about it that way. And then incisive questions, which are thinking questions. Well, asking questions for a person to think differently, even that question earlier about how would somebody else respond to this, would untrue limiting assumptions. So replace the limiting assumptions that our clients make with a liberating one. So what are the assumptions? You know, a question I ask frequently is, are those assumptions taking you where you want to go? Are they taking you into the best version of yourself? Are they taking you into your idealized self? And how are you getting there? And then the place, she talks about where a client and a coach think together. And that is, you know, it doesn't matter. It's not that we're both geographically in place, but we're in that thinking partnership that we talked about earlier. And so these are the 10 thinking components that she thinks should be absolutely part of how we think together. And if you're doing all of these, then, you know, it's not simply a check the box, but the conversation should be more fluid. And like I said, you should be in that journey, not just the destination, and you're probably doing a lot more reflection as well. So we're getting to the end of the conversation, but before we get to a wrap up, Brian, Ursula, anything you'd like to add to what we talked about today?
I would love to squeeze something in on this previous slide. It's a great slide. And I just last week had a conversation with another coach, how you create psychological safety on Zoom. It was with a coach who traditionally went on site and now he's on Zoom. And I just wanted to, if you are looking for something to reflect, take this list. It's a perfect list and I love it very much for that. And just reflect on how you can use that and to translate it to a virtual environment, and how you can make your client and yourself comfortable and bring yourself in a safe space where you can hold the space for the client with psychological safety. I just wanted to squeeze that in.
That's a great ad.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ursula. That's a great ad. Brian, anything that you want to add? You're on mute, my friend. Yeah.
Oh, okay. How's that?
Yes.
Is that better?
Yeah. Much better. We can hear you
All right,
now.
cool. I forgot what I was going to say. No, I think just that reflecting, if we're not going to encourage reflection, both on the part of the associate and for ourselves as coaches, then we're sort of destined to be chasing our tail the whole time. We're not really learning from the past experience. We always talk about not living in the past, and that's exactly right. But how do we learn from the past, and how we do that is by reflecting, so that we can have that coaching go forward strategy. So thanks for the opportunity to share some ideas today.
Awesome. I'm just going to say that I get up every day and with gratitude for the folks that we have, the faculty. We have such a talented group of people, and thank you, Ursula, and thank you, Brian. You just demonstrated the level of talent we have at Global IOC. So thank you for your contributions.
You're
So,
welcome.
Thank you.
so we will continue with coaching to agility, self-coach leader in organizations, but we're going to take a break till September 11th. In the meantime, we're going to be populating the blog with a number of writings. We're going to be populating the communities of practice with many of the webinars that we've presented. We need some editing, but then they'll be available, and there'll be papers on thought leadership as well. Join us on LinkedIn. And don't forget to go back out to Global IOC and pay attention to what's going on in communities of practice. We've got 6 weeks to get a lot posted, so I'm looking forward to that. And once again, thank you to Brian and Ursula for awesome work today. And thank you all who attended. As always, reach out if you have any questions, and have a good rest of your week, a good weekend. And we'll see you in September. Bye-bye.
Bye.